Hello and welcome to this, our latest edition of Path to Power, where Ivan and myself are coming to you remotely. We're not meeting in the studio in Dublin because of the weather alert. We're right in the middle of the red warning at present. Ivan has stayed at home in Wexford. I've stayed in my house in Dublin. Aidan's in his house in Dublin looking after all of this. And on the programme today, we are going to be looking at the shenanigans in the Dáil earlier this week when it came to the election of Taoiseach. We're going to go in detail into the selections of cabinet ministers with a particular emphasis on housing, which is going to be one of the big issues for this government. We're also going to be talking a little bit about further developments in our own race for the presidency later this year. And of course, we are going to be talking about Donald Trump's inauguration earlier in the week and the flurry of activity since and how that might be of significance to us here in Ireland. So we've a lot to get through even before we get to the subscription edition with bonus material as well. So, Ivan, I have to start though by mentioning the weather. When I said to you a couple of days ago, sent you a text suggesting that we might have to do this, you were still, not another one of these red alerts from Met Éireann like the one we had a few weeks ago. I'll get the train, I'll be there. But then public transport stymied you, no trains running. But it does seem that as we speak, about 1/3 of all the houses in the country are without power, that the red warning was actually warranted in this case.
Well, we'll see. We're doing this on Friday morning, right in the middle of it. But I'm looking out the window here. Been a bit breezy overnight. My train for 6 a.m. was cancelled. I don't really see how the trains could be that impacted. But, you know, Jerry Murphy on again. Oh, 110, wind speeds of 110 kilometers. Oh, 183, Jerry, put it on me. I mean, like, please. Okay, we'll get over it. This is going to be short-lived. Would everyone please get back to work? Delighted to see one of the things that Trump did. All federal workers get back to the office 5 days a week. We need that kind of get on and do it attitude in this country.
Well, two things I'll say to you in relation to that. I think we will see a push towards putting more people back into the workplace. The professional classes have been able to do hybrid working and maybe 3 days a week in the office, 2 at home. That might be coming to an end, particularly in the American multinationals. And I suspect that Taoiseach Micheál Martin wants to get public servants back into the office himself for a greater number of days in the week than they're there at present. But it would add to all sorts of traffic congestion if you were to do that, given that we now have 2.8 million people at work in the country. So that's a consideration to be taken in as well. But I also have to say to you in relation to the weather, Ivan, just because you live in the sunny southeast, which probably had the least of it, that the wind had maybe to an extent petered out compared to the battering that the west of the country got and the Midlands. It's all not just about Ivan's experience, Ivan. It's about what's happening to everybody rather than just you.
Well, the storm in the Dáil that I really want to talk about first, because I actually could see this coming. When we were speaking last Thursday, 8 days ago on our last podcast, I was telling you that I had a fairly deep dive of a ring around to people in Sinn Féin, Labour, Soc Dems, and in the opposition in relation to the Senate elections and analysis. And I could absolutely tell the strength of feeling about this idea that the regional independent group and independents that weren't ministers but supporting the government, essentially backbenchers, were going to be looking for a special technical group. And you know, I have to say that I was speaking to some of the regional independent people and they were simply asleep at the wheel. When I said to them, you know, there is real venom in this, you're on the wrong tack. So I blame this entirely on Sean Kenny and Noel Grealish as the leadership now in government, because Lowry is no longer the leader of the regional independent group. Let me put it this simply. There are 4 TDs, Danny Healy-Rae, Barry Heenan, Michael Lowry, and Gillian Toole, which are effectively regional independent backbenchers, government backbenchers, in the same way that 6 TDs were in the last Dáil. Patrick Costello, Brian Ledden, Francis Noel Duffy, Nessa Hurricane, and Stephen Matthews. They were green backbenchers, and that is the analogous position. Standing Order 170 is quite clear that a group formed in a technical group is part of the opposition, not part of the government. And so therefore, what was required was the new leadership, which is the 2 super junior ministers of the regional independents, should have negotiated and included in the negotiations provision for Dáil time in the same way that Dáil time is provided for green backbenchers in the last Dáil. And that was an oversight. Obviously it comes back on Simon Harris and Micheál Martin, but there was a duty of care to look after those backbenchers. And the way that Michael Lowry is clearly the lightning rod for attack on the government. They're calling them the Lowry Independents. And Verona Murphy, and I was strongly advising them that she was going to be the collateral damage and meat in the sandwich here. Now, I've been, through many, many Dáil rows. So what happens, and I just want to talk you through this for a second, Matt. So a deputy is disorderly, usually in opposition. So the first thing is the Count Corla says, please sit down. And they don't sit down. So then the Count Corla stands up. So the rule is when the Count Corla is on their feet, everyone must sit down. Then you ask to please sit down on your feet, and you ring the bell, and you do that a couple of times, and the deputy still persists. And then what happens is you ask them to leave the house voluntarily. If they don't do that, you then turn to the government benches and say, I propose that such and such a deputy is so unruly that they be named. In other words, they be kicked out for 3 Dáil days, and then you have a vote on that. And the real trap for Verona, which she avoided, was, and I think the government would have loved if she named Matt Carty or whatever. And the fact of the matter is that would have made her position untenable with the opposition. And she successfully suspended the whole house and put it back on, both sides. But she was put in a desperate situation. She tried to get an interim solution. And I was blunt. The only way that she could extricate herself from this was to visibly disavow herself from Michael Lowry. And that actually, on the second day, is what she happened because she didn't recognize the regional independent group on day 2, which was sort of drawn a fissure between herself and Michael Lowry, which was a hard thing to do because she should be thankful to him. So I really think the lesson of this is the regional independent group, and I mean all 9 TDs, including both Ely Rays, need to start thinking like an organised political party in terms of government business, because there'll be other manifestations of this circus approach, and they need to get their act together.
Couple of observations on that, Ivan. I'm interested that you blame Noel Grealish and Sean Canny, because certainly the opposition were trying to make this more an issue about Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, but I suppose that was their political objective in relation to this. The solution that Verona Murphy found, you sort of wonder, well, why didn't she actually do that on day 1? Given that there still hadn't been agreement as to the standing of the regional independents, then she should have at the very outset have said, well, we're not going to allow them the speaking rights today. We're going to have to try and get this sorted out. So I would have thought that was a tactical mistake. But to be blunt about it, you can't have your cake and eating it. You can't be completely Jesuitical in politics. And although I suppose independents have a right to regard themselves as neither being supporting of government or supporting of opposition, that they will vote on each individual issue depending on how they find it. These aren't now genuine independents in the sense that they have come together as a group to deliberately sign up to be part of the government. You can't be both things simultaneously. And I can understand exactly why the opposition doesn't want them to have speaking rights, because instead of holding the government to account, as opposition does, they're much more likely to be using their time to praise the actions of the rural independents involved in government. Danny Healy-Rae, for example, is unlikely to get up and attack Michael Healy-Rae for his actions as minister. So it just simply doesn't make sense. And they still have to get to a solution in relation to this. But I suppose obviously they're going to have to be classified as government supporters. But it does bring us on to the issue of how this was all handled by the opposition. And I think the point that you make about Verona Murphy showing a degree of calm rather than actually suspending individual members of the Dáil is a very valid one. I suppose the issue for many people is, well, there's a couple of issues. One is just simply the whole decorum of the whole situation, that this just looked really, really bad, in that it might have been a sort of a club GAA convention in the way that people started behaving in our national parliament, showing absolute lack of respect for the speaker. I'm sorry, no offences to GA clubs all over the country. I'm sure the vast majority of them work on a very convivial basis, but occasionally you might have what you like to call a brouhaha of this type of nature. But it was unseemly and it was unnecessary. And it also raises serious questions as to whether this is the approach that the opposition, particularly Sinn Féin, intends to take in this Dáil, as to whether it intends taking a more sort of populist Trumpian approach to providing opposition. Matt Carthy denied that to me when I interviewed him on The Last Word on Thursday evening. But I think it is interesting that since the general election, I just wonder how long it's going to take for Sinn Féin to sort of run out of steam, because they have been angry opposition from day one since they lost the election, flooding the media with press releases, giving out about this, giving out about that, and we'll get to housing in a little while. But I just wonder from your take how you felt about the appropriateness of the way that they went about it, delaying the election for a day, and what this presages for what might come in the lifetime of this Dáil.
Few things there, Matt. First of all, I think it did show when the opposition and the left work together, the sum of the parts is actually pretty formidable, and they can paralyze the Dáil. And while they have different tones on it, I thought that was, and we'll speak later about a joint left candidate for the presidency and why it makes sense. I think you did get a glimpse of the collective opposition, which they failed to do in the election campaign, they failed to do in the post-election campaign. But for the future, I think politics is going to be more polarized. I think that it's going to be more visceral. And there is a genuine left-right, in simple terms, divide. But for me, there was a political masterclass on the evening after the Shemazel. And this was the best dog whistling I've seen in ages. So Micheál Martin comes out with a sort of phalanx of all the people surrounding him, Harris and all this kind of thing. And he didn't get in a word edgeways on the Wednesday in the Dáil. And to use terms like subversion, the constitutional role. And I don't know if you got the dog whistle, but the dog whistle was to say, well, actually, Sinn Féin, you've now seen the mask slip. This is the type of tactics they do. They subvert democracy. Do they even recognize the Irish state, Ugly Naharan, and all of this? And I just thought it was absolutely saying to Middle Ireland, take a good look at these tactics, because is it what you want in your national parliament? And I just thought, without overstating it, when he used the word sort of premeditated, but the particular words of subversion and the constitution, did you pick up on that?
I did, Ivan, and I think actually this is where there's an interesting divide might emerge amongst the public, because for all of the people that I know who were shocked and horrified by what they saw, who felt it was unnecessary as well as unseemly, who felt that this row could have been sorted out after we had the election of a Taoiseach, and people even thinking, look, on a personal level, when it comes to good manners and the rest of it, Micheál Martin had his family there, As it turns out, as we discovered subsequently, he was very much looking forward to it happening on Wednesday because it was the anniversary of his father's death. So it was sort of an emotional thing for him. When it actually happened that he was elected on Thursday, one of his children, Michal A, couldn't be there because he'd actually had to return to Cork for Gaelic football training with the Cork County team. And so that was a sort of a big family issue, which, and I was, you could say, well, look, these are minor things in the overall scale of things, but they are important to people. And I think, if you were in a situation of a family occasion, something major like this, you'd be upset. But for all the people, though, who said that, I also came across a lot of people who said, good enough for them. This was a stroke that the government was trying to pull. This was outrageous, this idea that they could ram through this thing that you can be part of government and you can be part of the opposition. We don't want the stroke politics. And who justified, to me, the activities. I'm not sure how much they saw of the bullying of Verona Murphy, because whatever you think of the way that she got the job, that Michael Lowry negotiated it for her, about her abilities to speak in Irish, which is a prerequisite of the job, all of those various things. I think a lot of people as well did not like the sight of the disrespect shown to her and wondered, would a man have been treated in the same way that she was? That the first female Ceann Comhairle had to put up with all of these people out of their seats approaching her in a way. But then we have a certain number of people who seem to think that's okay. And I just wonder, is that going to continue in the lifetime of this Dáil?
Well, I did think that there was an intimidation of Verona. She is inexperienced about. There's no question about that. And that vulnerability they took full maximum advantage of. But there is something that you're alluding to there, which is, I think, a bad start for the government. And that is there a real justification for Ford Super Junior ministers? Is there a real justification for 23 junior ministers? This has never happened before. I was told previously the limit was 20. It seems somewhat indulgent. I don't take the Dáil recessing for 2 weeks, because in the subscription episode, I'll tell you what it's like for the first 2 weeks of the semester and the amount of people you've got to meet in your own department to get a fix on it, and the boxes of data and really technical and detailed data that you got to read. So that I actually think if you go back to 1920, there's always been a period, and like the only minister who's continuing is Peter Burke in the same role. So there is a lot of reading into it. But if you throw in then the additional allowances, which is the expenses allowances, so the salary of a junior minister is 113,000, and it's essentially an extra 30,000 to cover, and they do have costs, I accept that, but like that, it certainly sends out, and Barry Heenan getting money as $7,000 as a government whip, and to say under Standing Order 710, which just clearly just defines technical groups in opposition. So what we need to do is change the standing order to clearly define into technical groups. And I think it is a group of 9, to be quite honest with you, not to make it over complex, which includes the Healy-Raes and all of the 7 regional independent TDs. That needs to be classified in a group in the same way that the Green Party was, that the PDs were, that the Labour Party were, as a junior partner in government. It'll make the government more cohesive, and it'll also avoid this type of situation. But on the central point, could they be categorized as opposition TDs? I said to someone close to Verona, I said, look, it's like this. Lowry is brilliant at negotiating. He's brilliant at herding cats, but just watch out that he doesn't do something that'll drive you over a cliff, and don't be holding his hand when he does.
Because he might go off burning a few documents, as alleged by Pierce Doherty of Sinn Féin in relation to a particular property deal in England that was once investigated by the Moriarty Tribunal. Okay, we need to take a break. And when we come back, we should go through the government selection in detail, because while the Fine Gael side was very much as we had predicted and expected, Micheál Martin true to form, I think, from the last time, threw a few curveballs into the mix. So we'll get to that when we come back after the break. Welcome back to Path to Power. So we're going to talk now about the selections for cabinet that were made by the Taoiseach Micheál Martin. And the Fine Gael side is very much as we had expected. We had told you on this podcast from very early on that Ivan expected Martin Hayden to become the Minister for Agriculture. I very early on said that I believed that Jennifer Carroll McNeill was going to be the person who would go to the Department of Health. And that was very much what happened. And actually, Ivan, just before we talk about Fianna Fáil, let's just talk about those Fine Gael selections that Simon Harris has made. He's put himself into foreign affairs. He's given himself the trade brief with it as well. I suppose the one that surprised a few people, there had been talk that Helen McEntee might go to enterprise and trade and employment, but Peter Burke has stayed there, having only been in the job for a short time, might have to have been promoted by Simon Harris. And instead, Helen McEntee goes to education, which would that look like a sort of as safe a selection for her after her difficulties in justice as she possibly could have got?
On the Fine Gael side, first of all, the big shock for me, and it is truly shocking, and I actually didn't believe it at first, is that since Simon Harris has become leader, joined at the hip, he has been to Chris Donoghue as the government press secretary and is, I would say, one of his closest and most ardent advisors. And after 7 years working with Simon Coveney and others, he's decided to quit politics. In very amicable terms, I understand. So this removes one of my sources, which is very painful, but also, although he told me nothing. But the truth.
Sorry,
the truth of it
you do know as a journalist, and you are a journalist, you are not supposed to reveal the identity of your sources unless they give you express permission to do so. Has Chris allowed you to say that he is one of your government sources?
But he's one of my useless government sources insofar as that he tells me what he wants to spin to me. But sorry, that Hugh O'Connell's appointment there, I find interesting. But I just think Simon Harris might make a few small slip ups without him. So, firstly, I think the only one that's unchanged is Peter Burke. I think it's a really good idea to add tourism, which is an enterprise, to enterprise and trade. I think that it's the very same. You're looking at export earnings. It's a 10 billion euro industry. It'll actually bring the hospitality sector right into the business sector. And I think that's long overdue and is clever. And it's a better fit than putting energy there. On Helen McEntee, I had heard, because you will recall back last April, when Simon Harris had won the leadership, was he going to make any changes? Now, at this stage, the deputy leader was Heather Humphreys. And I heard at that stage, because Helen was taking a lot of flack in justice, being seen to be too close to Drew Harris, just different things. She just wasn't seen to be on top of what is a, very, very tough department, and throw in the migration, the controlling numbers at the border. Remember the time she said 80% were coming from Northern Ireland and they didn't have proper data. It was a bit of a comedy of errors. At that time, I was told by people close to her that she actually wanted to go to education. And now, so that would have meant further education at that time, because Fine Gael didn't have, through Norma Foley, Fianna Fáil had the education thing. So that comes as no surprise to me that she wanted to go there. And as deputy leader of the party, after Heather left, she would have had the pick of departments. So in no way is that a demotion for Helen. In relation to the rest of them, I'm delighted for Martin. I was actually at a conference in September in Naas, an ESG and dairy conference or food conference. And he's doing the opening thing. And when he was going, when I was thanking him and he had to leave, I said, don't be surprised if after all the rula-boolia and the hurly-burly of an election and a government formation, if this man ends up as Minister for Agriculture. So before the election, I predicted that. He has really well got, for example, the entire thoroughbred industry in Kildare, in the Irish Field, were ringing me to say, is he going to be minister, a week ago? And I said, definitely. And they really wanted him because he's he goes racing and he knows all the studs and that, and would have been a good supporter of HRI. So that's a very popular appointment. In terms of Jennifer, the amount of people who are saying to me, oh, now between now and the rotating Taoiseach, there's a chance of a leadership heave in Fine Gael. And I've heard this from Fianna Fáil people. There's no prospect whatsoever of a leadership heave. There's 23 new deputies, which could turn out to be all sorts of banana skins in their own right. Did you hear one Fine Gael deputy miss the vote? Didn't understand the closure of the door thing. So Matty McGrath's vote gave them the 95 that they needed. What is it, a majority of 18 or 19? And he actually was missing. So one of the hidden risks for Fine Gael going forward is what type of lulas might be on their backbenches. And we can talk about the junior ministers presently. But Jennifer Carroll McNeill's appointment to health is, okay, try this dish of poison and see how you get on. I think that, let not ambition mock your graceful toil would be my advice there. So basically, Patrick O'Donovan, as we alluded to last week, is very close to. She gets Catherine Martin's old job. Interesting how he will be minister for RTE, and of all ministers in the last administration, senior or junior, he was the most visceral about RTE and handouts to RTE. So I'll be very interested to see that. Also from Shane Ross's book, he was the junior minister in that department. So he's very familiar with sport and all of that communications brief. So I think that's a reasonable point. But as you say, in overall terms, they succeeded in managing expectations. Hildegard Naughton, Alan Dillon not getting in the cabinet, he'd kind of sent messages to them, look, you'll hold the job you have. So there was no real surprises, and Martin Hayden, as one of the negotiators, was put on the front foot, and that told people, look, he's the one of the junior ministers that's going to get the bump up.
So I suppose, Ivan, I do want to get into all of the Fianna Fáil appointments, and I particularly want to place an emphasis on what's happening in housing, which I think is the most remarkable part of the selections made. But gender and geography is something else that I want to get to before looking at Fianna Fáil, though I suppose Fianna Fáil is where we bring that in. There have been complaints in relation to geography from Sinn Féin in particular, not enough for the west of Ireland, although Dara Calleary is clearly now re-promoted back into cabinet. Nobody for the border regions because of Charlie McConnell-Logue getting dropped from the cabinet. So those are the two main geography issues. But gender, I think everybody was surprised. I think it was taken as a given that there are only 7 Fianna Fáil female TDs. Given that Mary Butler was regarded as having done a very good job as a junior minister, the expectation was that she would be promoted to be part of the cabinet. Instead, she's government chief whip. She is super junior for Fianna Fáil, and it means that of this 15-person cabinet, only 3 are women. And there was the two of us talking a few weeks ago, and you were given out to me because I suggested it should be at least 7 women to be more representative of the country. So what do you make of the gender and geography issues?
Well, let's take the geography first. There's always bitching and whinging about the geography, and I see the border counties with Heather Humphreys gone and McConnell gone, which I actually predicted, and I'll tell you why he was dropped. They did a great job in Donegal. They took the Fine Gael seat and they got their 2 seats. Pat the Cope got back, despite Micah. But for both Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil, in Munster and Leinster, the best land in the country, there is a whole farming vote. And I'm really calling it an IFA larger farming vote. And McConnell did not connect with them. He was seen as either not really a farmer, but if he was a farmer, it was a small hill farmer in the West. And, the real power base of our 20 billion agri output industry is there. And he just didn't connect with them. And they were telling Micheál he's not the man for the future. So I knew he wasn't going to be reappointed, but I knew Fine Gael was going to take that portfolio anyway. I think Dara Calleary in meant McConalogue out. And so therefore there was only going to be one in that region. Look, you can say Cork has no minister other than the Taoiseach. Like, I'm sick of this geography stuff. I mean, like, you're not entitled to one for everyone in the audience. Like, there's a genuflection to geography. Now, on the gender question, my overriding position is I want the brightest, hardworking, and best people in the job. Being a minister is very demanding. The job is very complex. You've got to deal with complex relations with senior civil servants to get the best out of them. You've got to deal with colleagues. You've got to deal with the Department of Finance. You've got to deal with the EU. Like, you do not want gobshits in these jobs if they're man or woman. I'm sorry. So that's number one. And I think Micheál has always tried to have had regard to ability, and I think Dara Calleary has ability. So the problem on the gender side is Fianna Fáil only have 7 TDs. And Mary Butler, look, to be honest with you, if you want to advance your career, the best job you can get is chief whip. You have FaceTime with the boss. You actually organise the whole Dáil business, and it is one of the most pivotal. A bad whip can cause enormous problems. And some people were very critical of the role of Hildegard Naughton in dealing with the Dáil row, that she was too abrasive with the opposition. So I think Mary Butler is a good fit for that. I had a text from her last night. She's delighted to get that job. But let's be clear about it. The best people should be appointed to the job, and I'm delighted Jennifer has been appointed. She is a woman of ability in terms of the overall point. But this, Matt, I'll be quite honest with you, looking at politics for the last 4 hours, this is an NGO media issue. Like, you will not find that there'll be people who'll vote in the 2029, November 29 election on the strength of this. And of course, it's a great thing to have women leaders of Ivana and Mary Lou and Holly Cairns. It's all progression in the right direction. And even quotas in local government and all that kind of thing. There's more things can be done. But at this point in time, I think doing a good job is much more important than this media preoccupation with gender and geography.
Well, let's talk about doing a good job or not. And let's talk about one of the most interesting decisions made by Micheál Martin to move Dara O'Brien out of housing to be replaced by James Brown from your own home county of Wexford. So I'm really interested in this because I suppose I have adult children who will be looking to buy their own home at some stage in the future, hopefully doing it themselves without expecting any help from their mother and father. But what really struck me in this was that going into the general election campaign, the government was making all sorts of claims as to the number of houses and apartments that would be completed by the end of 2024. And it wasn't just opposition politicians like Eoin O'Brien and Sinn Féin who were saying, no, you're not going to meet those targets. A friend of yours and mine, Ian Guider, who does my business news on The Last Word, consistently in recent months said, these targets will not be met. We will be fortunate to build as many new houses and apartments in 2024 as we did in 2023. And I say we as a country. And lo and behold, on Thursday, the day that Micheál Martin becomes Taoiseach and decides to move Dara O'Brien out of housing, it turns out that not only was the government nearly 10,000 shy of the number it had been telling us would be built for 2024, it actually came in a few thousand shy of what had been built in 2023. At a time of crisis in this country in housing, output is falling. So for all about your commencements and all about your new planning applications gone in and all the rest of it, and despite the efforts that had been made in relation to utilities and connections, we had a fall off. And the opposition, I think, is entitled to jump up and down and show this has been a failure. So why should we believe that this new government coming in will be any better than the outgoing government in reaching targets? Is there any chance of 300,000 new homes being built in the lifetime of this government? Because unless something dramatic changes, I don't see it happening. Do you?
before I give my take on that, what's your take on the appointment of James Brown as Housing Minister?
I have a couple of things in relation to that. He's a barrister who had been working in the Department of Justice. What does he know about housing? What does he know about all the financial issues? And I want to come to that as well in a moment, because I wonder if our problems in 2024 were caused by the political demonization of private capital in build to rent. And no matter how much people might dislike it, that without that, we do not get apartments built. But I don't know if James Brown, I think people say that he piloted the gambling legislation through well. Yeah, he did. Probably that's fine. But everything I've heard is that he is not necessarily the most impressive of ministers. Is he going to be strong enough to deal with the issues in housing? In fact, this is one of the things I wonder about this government. Is it actually going to now that it has a sizable majority, is it going to actually be brave enough to push things through instead of always backing off in the face of opposition complaints? Will it actually say, look, much as you may not like it, the state cannot afford to build all of the houses and apartments that we need. We're going to have to get private capital in. And if that means doing things to attract private capital, despite the public opprobrium, the opposition complaints, will it be strong enough to do it? So I just wonder, is James Brown going to be a strong enough minister to actually do that? And what support will he get from the government to actually do what's necessary once he has read himself into the brief?
Well, I think there's something significant happening here. James Brown worked closely with Micheál Martin over the past year to draw up the manifesto. He was more involved than any other Fianna Fáil politician in chairing the manifesto deliberations and outcome. And the Department of Domestic Affairs and different new ideas about migration and so on. And he has a very close working relationship with him. And I think the de facto Minister for Housing is actually going to be Micheál Martin. And if I was advising him, I would advise him to call an immediate summit with the top 10 builders in the country, your Cairn Homes, your Glenveigh, your Ballymore, your Clancy Brothers, BAM, CISC, whoever, and just have a summit on getting it done on transactional delivery. The second thing, and I just think the optics of him being in a pair of boots, a high vis and a hard hat every week would be really impactful. But I know, because I spend more time in dealing with housing, both in terms of my business interests and in terms of CIF and all of that. And it's my area of greatest interest in actually building houses, blocks and mortar, infrastructure development, electricity connection, planning permission, and all of that. And I think it requires a whole of government response. And unless the Taoiseach and John Callan say to the Department of Public Expenditure, you need, like, money was given, I don't know how many billion to Irish Water. They decided to give 60% to that to pay off debt rather than actually get new projects. So on so many things, we've been hand-tripped. But did you not see the biggest appointment of all? Robert Watt this week has been moved from Secretary General in Health to Housing. Now, Dara was looking to get out of housing because he knew the housing figures were a bit disappointing. The reason why they're disappointing is they've collapsed in terms of apartments. And this is what Clonliffe was all about, beside Croke Park, the Hines development of 1600. They were all apartments, tower blocks for 1 and 2 bedroom studio apartments, which were for single people. Those are down about 9,000 a year. And until we revert to a policy of supporting those in central Dublin, like we spoke about Dundrum last week, this will not be fixed. We've also got to change the planning system. So I'm hopeful. Now, I think it will take both Robert and James a year to read themselves into it, but I think it's really vital that they have a weekly group involving Jack, with with public expenditure, with James Brown and with the Taoiseach and Robert Watt, driving really this forward. And you know what? You're absolutely right. The government will live or die on the CSO returns in 25, 26, 27, 28. How many houses and units did you actually build? And, there are people who, and this so we need 24 billion a year. The program for government says that we need that. Where is that going to come from? So you need to talk to those people who are outside of government. There isn't a state construction company, and I don't think it's a good idea. So you've got to talk to the people who are actually going to deliver. And if you go on site and say to Michael O'Flynn, what's the problem with delivering this block or that block? And they tell you about, getting consent from ESB networks. They tell you about getting a water connection. You actually come up close and personal to these issues. And, the only reason why there's a surge in new starts was a very significant check was written. And it was really Dara's own initiative to give this once-off rebate of planning contributions and Irish water connections as a once-off thing, which they can't repeat. So the Land Development Agency, the zonings, the audit of vacant and derelict houses, these things are actually set out in 7 pages of not bad stuff in the programme for government. And I just think that unless there's a whole of government approach, unless the Taoiseach says, if you have 10 priorities, Matt, you have no priorities. This is where Trump is right. You pick 1 or 2 things, be it migration or be it, investment in terms of jobs. You can only focus on so many things. And if Harris is going to be off dealing with Trump and dealing with international issues and EU affairs, because really the Taoiseach is minister for everything and minister for nothing. We spoke about Simon Harris. He was on every dog and divil in the summer because he became minister there was a crime scene. There was a minister for disability. He was doing everything. Micheál, with all his experience in government, needs to bang heads together and say, by the time I walk out of this office, we must have built 300,000 houses. What are you going to do to deliver this right now? And I actually think it's the relationship between Micheál and James is the reason he's been picked, so that Micheál can run the show.
We need to take another break. I want to talk about the other Fianna Fáil appointments to the cabinet, and I also want to talk about Trump's inauguration this week and his threats to tax and what that could do for the government finances, because whatever about what we might feel about what Trump is doing domestically, what he is going to do internationally could have major implications for our ability to finance all of the things that we do in this country. So we'll get to that in the last part of this edition of Path to Power after this. Welcome back. So let's continue with discussing the government announcement. And we just have a few left in Fianna Fáil to focus in on. Norma Foley didn't go where we had expected her to go. She's now got responsibility for children and disability. And we have the promotion of James Lawless as well to higher education. So what did you make of these further Fianna Fáil selections?
Well, few people who I think the junior ministers will be announced next week. I think Niamh Smith and Timmy Dooley that weren't in the first round will be in the second round. Niall Collins, Thomas Byrne, a lot of those people who might have felt they'd earned a jump up, I think they will be looked after. And I would just put a little tip. Catherine Arda, who seconded Micheál Martin, who is a woman in Dublin, I would definitely think she is due for a jump up. She has a long tenure as a senator and so on. So, and I think she's favoured by the Taoiseach. And I think on the Fine Gael side, you're going to see plum jobs for Neil Richmond and Alan Dillon. And I'd say the one backbencher will be promoted because of his Senate experience, and he was on the negotiation team, is John Cummins of Waterford. I have hopes that Darragh O'Brien will. There's a huge problem we've spoken about many times in relation to energy. We can't have data centres because we don't have enough electricity. The Air Grid system set out a programme, Air Grid 2025, in over 10 years ago. None of it's been built. To get that done, he needs to drive it forward to get the 4,500 megawatts of electricity, as well as dealing with transport issues and roads. So Dara's got an important piece of work. I think he's delighted because I heard his relationship with Robert Watt wasn't great. So that put the tin hat on him, staying in housing, as I understand it. James Lawler has got I think education should have been put back together, but further education, I think they're emphasising the science element. The biggest surprise to me was the reappointment as Rossa Fanning as Attorney General. Clearly a Fine Gailer. I was surprised at that. Put it like this: the big one for me, Norma Foley, be grand in the Department of Children. It's lost migration. The big gamble is the appointment of Jim O'Callaghan. Now, a couple of things I'd say about that. I think there will be reverberations within RTE. It was one thing for Jim to be a frontliner, to be in such a senior cabinet position. I don't think Miriam can stay in current affairs really in that, and I think a new role will have to be got for her there. I just think it's a problem, and I think that either she'll be even harder on Fianna Fáil or whatever, but that is unintended consequences. But he has a massive brief. He has all aspects of migration. He has the police, the courts, the prisons. You've spoken about a new prison. He's a first-time newbie as a minister. He is a very charming man. He is part of the recovery in leafy Dublin for Fianna Fáil. That's why I think he's got the job. And crime is an existential bigger threat in Dublin than anywhere else. So big shoes for James Callaghan to fill. I wish him well with it, but I wouldn't be under any doubt this is a big risk. And it's a big task, and this will decide his leadership credentials going forward. And it could be a massive success, or it could be a problem. And always in justice, there are landmines ready to go off. That, for me, is the appointment I'll be watching most closely. I think it shows Micheál in a good light in terms of burying hatchets. Jim O'Callaghan has been critical of the last government. He turned down a junior minister. He's been sort of criticising on the sides, and he had clear blue water between him being Fianna Fáil justice spokesperson and Helen McEntee, and didn't make her life that easy. He's well capable of drafting legislation, but I think that's a gamble. It could pay off in spades and could broaden FF's appeal, and he could do a great job if he's a disruptor and goes in there. But put it like this, to be reviewed as we go on.
Okay, briefly, last week you revealed that Senator Francis Black could be the candidate of the left in the presidential election, which is interesting because this is the week since even we spoke last weekend, the government has backed off on the Occupied Territories Bill, which she sponsored, which she brought into the Seanad, which got accepted, and which now the government is very critical of, saying that it doesn't meet particular needs and the rest of it. But I think you have further information which has copper fastened your belief that she is the woman that the left will unify behind. Although that does bring up interesting things as to whether the presidential election will become a referendum on our position on Palestine and Israel.
So what I'm hearing is that the smarts in Sinn Féin, Soc Dems and Labour are saying, look at the last two presidential elections. Both won by Michael D. One, they developed into two-horse races in the last few weeks. In other words, someone who was on 15% ended up being on 5%, someone like Gay Mitchell, because if you're not going to win, why would I vote for you? So it becomes a two-horse race. So someone like Sean Gallagher in the first instance or Peter Casey gets momentum. So you have to see, do you have a candidate that will get into the last two? Even if there's six candidates in the field. Secondly, you can't run a decent campaign on less than 200 grand. And the rules are you don't get your election expenses back unless you get 12.5% of the first preference vote. So the situation is Fine Gael under Gay Mitchell didn't get their money back. Gavin Duffy had to pay for the 163,000 himself. So they're saying to themselves, Fianna Fáil didn't run a candidate in the last two European elections. You
Sorry,
have to run
President.
someone who is going to get your money back. So Sinn Féin's Leona Reida didn't get her money back. So I think, especially after this week's cohesion between the opposition parties, there is a compelling financial case. Instead of each of the three parties spending 200 grand each, that they agree on a candidate. A, to get the person in the field early, like Mary Robinson did, and just keep ticking away, traveling the country on local radio stations, getting the name recognition out and developing brand left in Ireland or centre left, however you like to call it. Developing the brand, an alternative to the FFG hegemony. You can write the script yourself. So I think Frances Black ticks all those boxes. She is awaiting re-election on the industrial and commercial panel, but a lot of people who I would rate in that left-wing grouping are saying that in terms of her personal relationships with the opposition parties, that she's a viable candidate. So, and that really FF and FG have so much on their plate. Do they really want to get mired into an opposing candidate between each other? Someone like Bertie, someone like Mairead McGuinness. So put it like this, I don't see them going to the cross if there's any risk their candidate could end up costing them net $250,000.
Okay, let's finish off by talking about the American president. Donald Trump inaugurated last Monday. And, you know, he's mad and he's bad in many respects. His contempt for the rule of law, his aggressive demonization of others, his threats towards those who won't support him, both domestically and internationally, his climate change hooliganism, and his lack of understanding of economics, which isn't surprising when you consider he's had 4 corporate bankruptcies and much else. You know how I feel about Donald Trump.
Oh, Matt, get off the fence.
I'm going to surprise you. One of the things that he's threatening is something that, from his point of view and America's point of view, I can actually fully understand. If I was the American president, or if I was in the American administration, I'd be looking at all of my multinational companies operating abroad, and I'd be saying, why are they paying their taxes in other jurisdictions rather than contributing the money in back here? There's an enormous need in America for more tax revenue. They run massive deficits every year. I mean, they run things quite badly at a government level. And for all the talk about efficiencies to cut back on spending, some of which they're trying to break through, they need more money in. So I think there's a reluctance to reduce the tax rates in case they have even less money coming in. But there is also the argument that they could do a Charlie McCreevy on it. By reducing the actual rates, they would encourage their companies to actually repatriate more profits and pay the taxes on them back in America. So that creates our difficulty in that, what if all of the giant American multinationals who have been putting their IP into Ireland and their international sales, even if they don't take place in Ireland, if they book them in Ireland and they pay their corporation tax profits on them here, now at 15%, previously 12.5%. We've been on a giant grift. This really wasn't money that should have been coming to us. We were a sort of a location of convenience. So I think that's at risk. And in fact, we've had successive governments over the years, and I've written about this for the Business Post at the weekend. Successive ministers for finance, Pascal Donoghue, who's now back in as Minister for Finance, Michael McGrath, Jack Chambers, all talking about windfall corporation taxes, that about 12 billion per annum and possibly more is not guaranteed to come back next year or the year after. And yet, what have we done? We have consistently, instead of either actually saving that money or spending the windfall as capital investments, we've added the money into covering current expenditure. So what happens if we lose those windfall taxes? So you mentioned correctly that expenditure on housing is going to be one of the major issues for this government in its term. But I think one of the major problems is economic good times do not last forever. And the major source of a lot of the revenue upon which we have become dependent is at the gift of external forces. And I think that could be the major problem for the government. And for all the talk, I saw the likes of Michael Lohan, the boss of IDA Ireland. He was in Davos this week. He told the Irish Times that he's confident that Ireland is well placed to deal with this. IBEC is confident that this isn't the biggest issue. I really hope that none of these people end up in this generation's Patrick Neary. Do you remember the guy in the central bank? The guy who told us that everything was tickety-boo, there wasn't a problem, nothing here to worry about. I think there are things to worry about, and I think that government spending could be under threat. It means maybe we'll have to borrow to fill the gaps, or maybe there'll have to be tax increases, personal taxes. Maybe there'll have to be spending cuts in the lifetime of this government, which would not be good for its re-electability. What do you think, Ivan?
Yeah, well, I think for the past year we've been warning about, the 28 billion corporation tax. It could go up in the short term, but IFAC have estimated 15 billion of that is in jeopardy for the reasons you've stated. First of all, I'm hearing that Ivy House and the government have actually been quite busy in upping their diplomatic representation in a number of individual US states, particularly in the southern states, which are quite Republican. Secondly, they've set up a panel of new Irish people they think will be supportive. So that's the Collison brothers, Patrick and John, Owen McCabe of Intercom, Brian Moynihan of Bank of America, and Limerick's Martina Chung of S&P Global. So it's not as if they've been unaware of this, and they have been working since November on that. Absolutely, and you've spoken previously about the risk to the pharma sector of the tariffs and the 56 billion of exports of that. Just on the Trump inauguration, needless to say, I was glued to every minute of it. Even the stuff in all the stuff he couldn't say in the inauguration speech, when he was back with the deplorables, getting them their pardon and all the rest of it, what he really wanted to do. And I have to say, the first year of Trump 1.0 was pretty chaotic. I think Susie Wiles has a good grip on things now, whether you like it or not. Paris Climate Summit, different international, extra WHO, and so on. The fact of the matter is they have hit the ground running with 200 executive orders, and they mean business. I think about Trump, first of all, personally, I think things, leaving aside all the rhetoric, hyperbole, and all, instead, if people spent as much time trying to understand American voters as they do demonizing Trump, we would be better served. Look, you can sum up MAGA in one word. It's American nationalism vis-a-vis the economic issues and migration issues, and it's a sense of patriotism to put back the USA as the top dog in the world order, economically and politically. And that makes Americans feel good, and everything he says and does is to that effect. So whether he'll be successful with migrants, deportations, whether, they actually need people who'll work in 100 degrees of heat and so on, I don't know how that's going to work out. I think that, we look at something like the Apple tax case, and that's an EU thing rather than an Irish thing, although there's huge consequence there. He regards that as an outrage that the EU would put this surtax on, as he would see it, on Apple. And he sees fines from our GDP regulator, on Facebook, as a tax on it. So he actually is quite unusual. There's something I'm involved in, which is going back to the Goodman era and the Beef Tribunal and the separation of politics and business. He is actually a cheerleader. On his sleeve, he carries the badge of US corporate America. Whether it's appropriate to that relation or not, that is his shtick. And so therefore, anything that's bad for corporates, and you saw the way they were all there at the inauguration, the tech giants and so on, all the ones sucking up to him, leaving aside Musk, all the other ones. The fact of the matter is, he sees part of his mandate to do the best to make US corporate world more profitable, more market share, more investment. And that's his credo, and he's going to stick to it. So obviously that involves a huge element of reshoring. But, what I'm really interested in, when you're on your second term of presidency, you actually become something of a lame duck because the succession preview starts after the midterms. Who is going to be jockeying for position to carry forward the MAGA sort of flag bearer? Will it be J.D. Vance? Will it be Marco Rubio? Will it be traditional Republican conservatives? And so therefore, I think the impact of Trump will be in the first 2 years and will abate after that, and he'll be playing more golf after that.
Okay, well, just the last word I'm going to offer in relation to this one is it's going to be very interesting. I mentioned climate change hooliganism, drill baby drill, and that his desire, and particularly in his speech to Davos on Thursday as well, he wants much greater oil production, drive down prices a bit to make energy cheaper. That is going to have major implications in, I think, investment for alternative energies, not just in America, but globally. This could further set back our already belated efforts to get into offshore wind farming. I think the amount of finance available could diminish. And he has a big thing against wind turbines, or windmills, as he calls them. He's very worried about the whales. Yeah, of course he is. So there is that. And I think when Michael McGrath, the EU commissioner, hinted on Thursday that he believes that the way to deal with Trump is to do more trade with him, do trade deals effectively for the EU. And I think Ireland's involvement in that could be that LNG terminal, which was agreed nearly 2 decades ago down in Kerry and Tarbert, which has never happened. I suspect that will now get the go-ahead, and I suspect we will be importing quite a lot of LNG reserves just to keep Trump happy, but that our environmental lobby will be absolutely disgusted. And I think that's going to be a thing as well. Already, I know some are giving out about the fact that we have a beef farmer as the Minister for Agriculture, and that we are looking at all sorts of issues in relation to climate change, been very differently handled in this government, particularly because of the need to keep Trump happy. But look, that's, I think, where we leave it for today. I think
can I just say one thing before I go, because beyond the last word studio and writing your columns, you really don't get out enough. I've had 2 big speaking gigs this week, and I just want to give a shout out to the Matrix Group. This is a group, and I listened to the CEO of the PSA, which is the Private Security Authority. I didn't know there's 35,000 people registered as security people. They could be bouncers, they could be working at night car parks and so on. So there's 13 different sectors in that. But these guys, anyway, it's a group of 100 of them, Jolene and the guys, they do all the purchasing. And they are actually, so every security alarm, fire alarm, CCTV system, these guys are in real business and working hard. And they've got this sweet spot of a model where they all compete against each other, the nationwide, but they do a purchasing model while retaining their agility. The other was the alumni of the Entrepreneurs of the Year. Have a group of about 600, all the finalists each year. It's going for 20 years or so. And they got together, the good and the great, all the people you love, very driven people. Dennis O'Brien was there, Roger Wallace, and all the good people there. And I gave them my pearls of wisdom on politics and that. But, at the end of the day, we're focused on the public sector, public policy, and government and politics. Out there in the real economy, there are people earning the 90 billion a year in total taxes that are in the indigenous industry that need the odd shout out. Would you disagree?
Not at all. I was in Cork myself during the week, and I ate in a lovely restaurant on Oliver Plunkett Street called Jacques. And, I meet people out and about as well. I have to say, I'm interested that you're interested in the security sector, because you have the look of a bouncer about you, except with that bad back. I don't think you'd be able to stop anybody entering any premises. We better leave it from there, okay? We have a subscription edition coming up as well for our subscribers. If you want to get in touch, mail at pathtopowerpodcast.com is where you do so. So hopefully we'll be back to normal next week, in that we will be face-to-face in the studio in Dublin. But hopefully the audio and video in this is sufficient for you. And hopefully if you are one of those without power or without broadband because because of the storm, everything will be restored quickly. And kudos indeed, Ivan, as you call them, the ordinary people, to all the ordinary people who will be out doing the work to restore all of that, even if you just think it was a little bit of a gale rather than a full-blown storm.